All right. Without further ado, first up, we have Brian Barry from University of California, San Diego, who will be talking about power law decay and eigenvalue spectra of neural population data. Take it away, Brian.
Awesome. Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Brian. I'm from Wojtek Lab at UC San Diego. And I'll be presenting on this talk relating the power law decay of power and eigenvalue spectra in neural population data. So in this talk, I'm going to first introduce the context of power laws, and then I'll dive into our research question and how we analyzed both neural data and simulated data to investigate it. So you may be familiar with how various kinds of electrophysiological data exhibit power law statistics. For example, the power spectrum of LFP activity is power law. So the power spectrum here, which shows the powers and frequencies in the signal, display this power law shape, meaning power spectral scales as a fraction of the frequency. When plotted in logarithmic axes, this is exhibited as a linear decrease. When a line is fitted to this log-log spectrum, as the slope is the exponent of the power law. So this shape raises the question, is the brain poised at criticality? So originating from physics, criticality is a characteristic of certain high-dimensional systems consisting of interacting units or particles, where the pairwise correlation of two units is a function of the inverse of the distance or the time elapsed between those two units. In other words, temporal and spatial correlations are scale-free. It's best to illustrate criticality with an example. Canonical system is the abelian sand pile. So in this model, sand is stacked vertically on a grid, and wherever sand is stacked more than 3 units high, the next time step, one grain is distributed to its 4 nearest neighbors. So the evolution of this model kind of looks like this, when 1,000 or so grains are stacked in the center. So critical spatial and temporal dynamics are reflected in these events called avalanches, which are clusters or bursts of threshold events. This animation here shows another 2-dimensional critical system, the Ising model, where the avalanches are sets of connected units, like these black islands here. Zooming in displays how these are distributed without any spatial scale. In other words, it is fractal or scale-free. If we measure the sizes and durations of these avalanches, as in these figures here, we find this power law shape. And as you can see, they are related. So neural activity also undergoes avalanche-like activity. Local field potentials, for example, when exceeding 3 standard deviations or some other threshold, have very similar distributions for their sizes and durations as these figures above. Power laws continue to appear in neural data. I discussed the power spectrum earlier, but this other measure, the eigenvalue spectrum, is also power law shape, as found in Stringer et al. 2019. The eigenvalue spectrum, or eigenspectrum, represents the distribution of population codes, each of which is made of contributions from certain neurons. And each code is orthogonal to the next. So the eigenspectrum is obtained from principal components analysis, dimensionality reduction technique, which is the eigenvalue decomposition of the covariance matrix over time. And putatively, this represents a balance between, this power law shape represents a balance between efficient and robust encoding. So the similarities between these two spectra leads to a question, are the power law exponents of these two spectra related? And if so, does their relationship depend on population size? The latter question builds on the scale-free theme to see if a small sample of neurons would represent the same critical dynamics as the whole. So the reason why we're interested in these two spectra is to see if the eigenvalue spectrum, which is a kind of spatial statistic, is related to any temporal statistics, as in those found from the power spectrum, which are also signatures of population encoding. Also, PCA considers pairwise correlations, unlike other measures like avalanche analysis. So if these two spectra are related, we can potentially construct more accurate measures of population encoding. So to investigate our question, we computed the correlation between the power spectra and eigenvalue spectral exponents in some neural data. We hypothesized that interspectral correlation would begin to appear at a certain subset size. So we looked at population data from neuropixels, which are probes that pick up population spiking. And our data set consisted of 10 regions on 3 different mice from Stringer et al. 2019. So this is kind of what our data looks like. So for 1,000 or so neurons, we have firing rate on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. And so the general pipeline for each mouse region pair is we take increasing subsets of random neurons. And for each subset of selected neurons, we decompose the subset using PCA and the Fourier transform to yield the spectra of interest. For the Fourier transform, we first sum the signals to yield a population vector. And these 2 figures show the spectra for one mouse region with subset size increasing from blue to magenta. Once we have our spectra, we use a spectral parametrization tool to fit exponents to each spectra. And we do this fitting and decomposition for many iterations, and then we compute the correlation between the power spectrum and eigenspectrum exponents. So here's some results for the first mouse in the hippocampal formation. This first set of figures shows the average exponent for each spectrum. You can see how the exponents seem to converge monotonically as subset size increases. These figures show the goodness of fit for both spectra. And you can see how the fits get better as more neurons are subsampled. And finally, we have the interspectral correlation as subset size increases. So this particular mouse region, it would appear that the correlation between the 2 spectra begins to appear at a certain subset size. So in general, the first 2 figures are representative of the general exponent patterns we saw in the rest of the regions. Overall, however, we find that the space and time decompositions were correlated only for some brain regions and in some mice. So this plot here is the average interspectral correlation between the 2 spectra. And you can see how correlation only occurs for around half or so of the mice regions, and statistical significance is sparse as well. We also found that there wasn't a specific threshold subset size at which any interspectral correlations began to appear. For example, in these 3 figures, we see the correlation as a fraction of, as a function of the percent of neurons sampled. And in a lot of regions, we see that correlation actually tapers off towards 0 as subset size sampling increases. So in order to test the null hypothesis that a non-critical system will not yield power laws in the eigenvalue spectrum, we simulated independent colored noise time series where the ground truth value are the exponents of the power spectrum. So we're simulating signals where we already know what the power spectral exponent is. So for each exponent in the range of exponents we used, we simulated around 100 time series and followed a condensed version of the pipeline that we used for the neuropixels data. So once again, we're computing PCA on the set of signals to yield the eigenspectrum. Here's the eigenvalue spectrum for each exponent, where the exponent is increasing from blue to magenta. And then we compare the spectral exponents for both spectra. So as you could see, the eigenspectra actually do obey a power law, even though the time series are independent and thus certainly not a critical system. When comparing the 2 exponents, the eigenspectrum exponent in this figure is on this axis, x-axis and the power spectrum exponents on the y-axis, we see that these two exponents are highly correlated to one another. So the takeaway here is that more robust measures of criticality should be investigated besides just power laws, because the power laws in the eigenvalue spectrum and the interspectral correlations seem to be necessary but not sufficient measures of criticality. Another possible implication here is that the neural manifolds that we obtain from our data may be from non-critical or even unrelated activity. That's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening. And I'm ready for any questions you may have.
Great talk, Brian. So that's the applause that you cannot hear from the attendees, and I'm giving in terms on behalf of the attendees. So we have a question right now from Jason Samaha. Thanks for the great talk. Could you unpack a bit what a negative or positive interspectral correlation means in terms of neural dynamics? Example, in terms of spiking or LFP dynamics.
Right. So at this point, I don't think we're actually too sure how to interpret that. But that is a great question.
Got it. So as we're waiting for more questions, I had a question. So the eigenspectra is that, I have a few questions. So first is the eigenspectra, is that a measure of the spatial information, right? So does that mean as you go further away, you have fewer correlations? Is that what it's trying to get at?
Right. So the principal components in the eigenvalue spectrum, each principal component is a neural code or like a neural pattern. And so each principal component is responsible for example here, a certain amount of variance of the data. So right, so like the first principal components are going to be responsible for the most variance in terms of the patterns in the neural population activity. And as you go up in the principal component dimensions, they'll be accounting for less of the activity, if that makes sense.
Okay, got it. Okay, cool. And so we have one more question from Maxwell Shin. Are there any types of analytical relationships you can derive between the two spectra in addition to the empirical results you showed?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Also, is there a way for me to see the questions?
Yeah, you should be able to click the Q&A at the bottom. If you can go to the Zoom. Or I can read it again slowly. So the basic question is like, what you have shown are empirical results, but can you derive some analytical relationships from what you know about these two types of spectra, like some sort of like theorems?
Oh, right. So this is another question where we're not too sure because there's potentially some mathematical rabbit holes that can be followed here, and usually stemming from criticality. But it would be definitely interesting to see other kinds of analytical relationships we can find. But for now, we really focus mostly just on correlation.
Okay, cool, nice. If you don't have any more questions, and thanks again for the presentation. And so we'll move on to our next speaker.